I'm Naya Berg. Today I will be recording my comparison of the interactions between the people of West Africa and their Portuguese visitors from the 15th to the 16th century, and the interactions between Southern Africans and the Dutch from the 16th to 17th century. I will be focusing on both the initial perceptions native Africans held towards the Europeans and the evolution of the relationships between Africans and Europeans during this time period. Beginning with West Africa, the initial encounters between the West Africans and the Portuguese took place in the 1430s and 1440s. These encounters were marred by the aggressive assault of the Portuguese on the West Africans, with several West Africans being captured and forcefully relocated to Portugal. According to the chronicler Zurara, the West Africans mistook the Portuguese caravel for a large fish or bird and sailed out to sea to investigate. They quickly realized that the Portuguese were humans as opposed to a large sea creature and promptly retreated. Clearly, the Africans were acting with caution from the very beginning, wary of these new arrivals with white skin. And the subsequent kidnapping of several West Africans by the Portuguese only intensified their fears. The Portuguese attempted to make peace in the mid 1440s, but the West Africans naturally rejected this peace due to the pillaging and assaults of the Portuguese prior. This led to a brief battle between two sides. Resistance to Portuguese diplomacy would continue throughout the rest of the decade, with the Wolof murdering the crew of a Portuguese caravel in 1446 and Danish knights being butchered by the Serer tribe in 1447. The initial encounters between the Dutch and South Africans were markedly less violent by comparison. Northrop notes in his book that the first instance of prolonged contact between the Southeast Africans and the Dutch occurred after the shipwreck of 1589, in which Dutch refugees were marooned, and South Africans offered the Europeans shelter and hospitality whilst they traveled to the nearest port to be rescued. The interactions between the two groups were pleasant. Europeans and Africans shared food, music, and dances with one another, coexisting peacefully and even forging friendships. The significance of this encounter is that different groups can live together in harmony so long as they show respect and empathy to one another, as opposed to acting with greed or ulterior motives. Refocusing on West Africa, the relationships between West Africans and the Portuguese were still tense during the 1450s. In 1455, the Serer people denied Cadamosto, a Portuguese trader, because they had heard rumors that Christians were cannibals and kidnapped West Africans to feast on them. This is notable because it gives some insight into the relationships between West African tribes during the 15th century. They clearly communicated with one another if news of the white men and their kidnapping habits had spread across the land, meaning these groups did not exist in total isolation despite being mostly self-sufficient. Also, West Africans knew little about Europeans or European culture, still ignorant to the growth of the slave trade abroad. They were confused about why the Portuguese needed to take so many slaves and assumed that the white men were eating them. During the 1450s, several successful peace talks between the Portuguese and West African chiefs, such as the chief Boudamont in 1455 and the Mande chief in 1456, greatly improved the relationships between West Africans and the Portuguese. This resulted in strong trading relationships between the two groups, with Africans selling gold, ivory, and spices to the Portuguese in exchange for horses, cloths, and metal goods. Africans wanted to buy European weapons from the Portuguese as well, but the Portuguese merchants were forbidden to sell crossbows or firearms in fear of the West African groups growing too strong militarily. This did not curb the West Africans' fascination with the Portuguese military, though, as evidenced by the presence of Portuguese soldiers in sculptures and engravings from both Benin and Sierra Leone during the 15th to early 16th century. The Benin state commemorated their relationship with the Portuguese in artwork, in part to bolster their strength in the eyes of their West African neighbors. Though West African and European relationships improved with time, South African and Dutch relations worsened. Rulers of the Congo, Mini-Congo in particular, tried to establish positive diplomatic relationships with the Dutch. However, The Dutch military occupied the southeastern African kingdom of the Congo, which forced the ruler to seek other alliances to oust the Dutch. The Dutch were eventually ousted from the Congo in 1648 with the help of the Portuguese and Ndongo kingdoms, but the Dutch did successfully take over Cape Colony in South Africa, displacing and exterminating the indigenous Khoisan groups in the area. Just as the European militaries could be a great ally, they could also be a disastrous enemy. Both West Africans and South Africans aligned themselves with European powers economically or militarily at different points in time, and sometimes the advantages outweighed the disadvantages, but that was not always the case. The Dutch were initially viewed by the South Africans as valuable trading partners, but then became a bitter enemy and an unwanted invader in the eyes of Africans, whereas the West Africans initially regarded the Portuguese as a savage enemy that should be avoided at all costs, but later came to view them as a powerful trading ally. Relationships between humans are dynamic and ever evolving. By examining relationships between Africans and Europeans, one can see that bonds can easily be forged or destroyed depending on the actions one takes.